Hello, this is Pappy McGillicuddy Sanchez coming right back at you. That's Pappy Sanchez for short, or just Pappy will do. Now, it seems like a few of you actually watched the video Bible teaching I did last week. I went on there and I said, Ma, look on YouTube. It's got a few views on that YouTube. Now, of course, having a view on YouTube might just mean that somebody clicked on her for 2 seconds. But as I said last week, I believe God is calling me to speak. Whether folks listen or not, but maybe you might find it helpful to see that Jesus and the early church outlined a very different way of living. Very different than the world usually lives in Acts. Very different than we are living in today's world in the United States of America. And perhaps even the early church offers a model for peace and reconciliation in today's world and country. Now, last week I actually taped the message before the Sunday night mass shooting in Las Vegas. And though I said I would post videos on Friday night, because the early Christian church met in the evening of the first day of the week, I decided not to do that because it just didn't seem right last Monday, as the country needed to focus on mourning those who were lost in the shooting. And I know many of you, like me this week, have been praying for the families of the victims, have been grateful and praying for the first responders. And I'm sure, did you hear the stories also of those who were in the crowd who, instead of running to safety, ran back amidst the flying bullets to drag others to safety? In the most harrowing times of hardship, the goodness of humanity always shines. And so I've been reflecting, like many this past week, on what happened. And I've been praying, and what's coming to my heart is something which I haven't heard other folks necessarily talk about. And that is the challenges of masculinity and manhood in our nation today. There is one strong commonality amongst all the mass shootings in the past 10 years in the United States, and that the vast majority of the shootings were perpetrated by men. The one notable exception that I can think of is the San Bernardino shooting, in which a married couple participated. And so it made me think about what the scriptures and Jesus and the early church taught about manhood. But before we turn to scriptures for today, I do want to read a quote from Jason Aldean, who is, of course, the country musician who was playing when the shooting happened. Mr. Aldean says, "Something has changed in this country and this world lately that is scary to see. The world is becoming the kind of place I'm afraid to raise my children in. At the end of the day, we aren't Democrats or Republicans, whites or blacks, men or women. We're all humans and we're all Americans. And it's time to start acting like it and start standing together as one." Amen, Mr. Aldean. And so I call once again for us to pray upon the scriptures of the early church to see how Christians can be beacons of light, peacemakers, and those seeking reconciliation to keep us united in love. manhood and masculinity, men are not doing well in this country today. There are many challenges. We know much has been written and spoken about the past couple years, and it is true, of the decline of consistent, stable employment over the past 30, 40 years. Employment that offered the ability for one to make enough money for one's family, to be stable, to know that the company would be there. And whether it be from jobs moving overseas or the increasing automation and use of technology leading to downsizing in employment, this has caused a great strain upon the feelings of manhood and masculinity in our country. And there are many other things that have happened. Been watching the wonderful documentary on the Vietnam War by Ken Burns. The 60s was in many ways a transformative time in this nation. We achieved a much greater level of civil rights and equality among the races, or at least laid stronger foundations for that. Women began to feel empowered to have their voice, to know that they can have professions. All these are wonderful things. A growing sense of the need for equality. But there's also tremendous confusion around the Vietnamese War, the war in Vietnam. It was a war many supported at first as a battle against communism. But as years wore on, it became obvious that our government was not being straightforward with us. There was a growing anti-war movement at home. Indeed, even many who fought in that war, most of whom were working class and poor folks, black and white and Latino. Because those of the upper class had a way out. Those who would later become president because they were from the upper class had a way out of serving in combat. And as always, it was the working folk who fought in our wars and suffered psychologically. Now, even during the war, it was confusing. It was a muddled mess. It was a battle against civilians. Even many fighting thought to themselves, why are we fighting this war? And they lost their buddies. They lost their pals. And they came home, and they were not respected like in previous wars. The 60s threw many things into doubt. I don't see it as an either-or situation. There were many wonderful things that came out of the 60s, but it also created great doubt. And then the idea of equality and freedom in the 60s turned into the 70s, when it just became about individual manifestation of one's desires, doing whatever one wanted. The sexual revolution, instead of just creating equality, created licentiousness. And although women were empowered for greater choice, it also took away the necessity of responsibility from manhood. We are living in a time when, there's an author named Charles Murray. And he got himself in trouble and got into a lot of controversy a while back writing a book called The Bell Curve. But he wrote a really insightful book called The Decline of White America. And in that book he pointed out how working class and lower class whites and blacks and Latinos are all going towards a trajectory of destabilization of the family. Destabilization of responsibility of men. If you are a working class or lower class child who is white, black, or Latino, the majority of you and your compatriots were born out of wedlock. Now, this is not to say that you can't have a loving family, A loving mother, a loving family is not based upon marriage. But empirical research in socioeconomics and psychology show that it's a very high risk way to live. And so increasingly there have been many forces who have come together where manhood is running amok. In churches, 60 to 70% of those in churches are female, trying to hold down the fort. If you're like me and you've worked with challenged folks in urban neighborhoods and in the countryside for years, more and more it's grandmothers trying to raise young boys. It is true that there aren't as many stable jobs as before, but also if you speak to anybody who's been around for a while in their 40s, 50s, and 60s working, you also know, and they will admit to you, that there are a lot of jobs that younger generation just don't want to take because they don't want to work that hard. Drugs are running rampant. We know about the opioid crisis. And so I certainly can offer no easy solutions. But I do know, when I look at those inflicting gun violence upon others, the vast majority are men. You know, Stephen Paddock, the shooter, his brother, talked about, poor guy. You have to love and sort of pray for the family members of those committing such atrocities. But he in interviews, he was incredulous. He said, I don't understand. Stephen, he was not involved in politics. He wasn't involved in religion. I don't understand what has happened. Well, exactly. Men who are having challenges are those who are disconnected from the larger community. They are not within institutions that require them to live with greater responsibility than themselves. They don't belong to... Now, sure, I get that, the dude that shot up the Orlando place have been radicalized by Islam. But we also know those who are radicalized online are those who are disconnected from actual human connection out in the real world. Same with Dylan Booth in South Carolina. He was watching some crazy folks on the internet. Some crazy little racist dudes on the internet. And he got thinking, I'm going to be crazy like them. But he did not belong to institutions in the world who gave him love and human connection and required responsibility and accountability. See, our intermediate institutions are in deep decline. What do I mean by intermediate? You have the individual and you have governments. The only way we remain a strong country if we have strong institutions in the middle. And what should those be? Those are your families. Those are your churches and synagogues and mosques. Those are the civic societies. Those are the volunteer fire departments. 90% of our first responders across this country are volunteer. And they're all across this country having deep problems of recruitment because the younger folks don't want to be bothered. And so I'm going to talk about, some folks are talking about, and this is semi-insightful. They're saying, this dude out in the West, Stephen Paddock, he was in the West, it's a Western thing. He's living in Nevada, from Texas. He was like a gunslinger. That was the problem. So I want to talk about the American mythology of the West because it is apropos. It's like not an apricot. It's apropos. See, you all don't know. I've studied at the Sorbonne in France, in Paris, for many years. Highly sophisticated and refined. Now, so you can see now what happened was... All right, so... the mythology of the West. We often think of the gunslinger. But in fact, in this country, there's been, especially in the wilderness, but in our deep psyche of manhood, two competing ideas of masculinity. The homesteader versus the gunslinger. Let's go back to my old buddy Kenny Burns. We grew up together, drinking down at the Irish pub. I said, Kenny, someday you got to make yourself some documentaries. He made a lot of documentaries. Now he made another great documentary called The West, about our expansion into the West. It's very complex. A lot of injustices done to Native Americans. Native Americans themselves have many complexities within them. But he shows these different strains of masculinity. And so you see all the dudes that went out and they heard about some gold. And Mom, gonna go make some money. And they went out to San Francisco and Idaho and Sutter's Creek and Nevada and all these places with the mines where they left east and they said, I'll send home money. They didn't need you to send home money. They needed you to keep your ass at home and pray and build a church and stay with your family and see your kids at night. Y'all would have survived. They didn't need you to get rich. See, the gunslinger mentality in this country it's not about stability and sacrifice and commitment, whether it be in the wilderness, in Nevada, in the countryside, or on Wall Street. It's about, I'm going to be a man because I'm going to conquer. I'm a man because I can make it all. I can defeat everybody else. That's the gunslinger mentality. And so they went out, and these folks, watch this documentary, you start to hear, so what did they do? Well, all the women folk and all the responsibilities were way back east before Skype. They couldn't even see each other on the Skypeness. And so they made whatever money they could during the week, and it was gone by Monday. And we all know what it was going on. Booze and hoes. See, men detached from stable jobs and detached from the responsibility of family and intermediate institutions do very poorly for themselves and very poorly for society. It doesn't turn out well. In fact, there are books and reams of historical researches looking throughout the history of civilization, East and West, showing that whenever there is a large group of unattached men in society, things go very poorly. But there was another type of man, the homesteader. The great story of a man courting a woman who went to Wyoming and got some land, and they had the only ranch, the only land in Wyoming in the in an area the size of Rhode Island. So you had to go as far as Rhode Island size away to see other people folk. And he spent a long time courting her, and she finally said yes, and they set up shop there. They built a house, they built a ranch, and then the storm would come, and the blizzard would come, and they'd lose half their cattle, they would almost starve, but they'd start again, and they had children, and a really touching story of a son who was still alive from that family, about when he and his father got really sick one winter. And the father lifted up the son, and they had been in bed for several weeks. And the son said, Daddy, I can't walk. And the daddy said, son, hold my hand. We will walk together. That's homesteader manhood. You're not so insecure that you got to go prove yourselves with sex and beer and alcohol. You're strong by being responsible and tender and loving. See, we'll get to other times, because the whole idea of the sexual revolution and the liberty for different folks to manifest their being, to be able to express themselves with sexual preference and sexuality. In many ways, that's been a good thing. But for many men of this country, that far end of the sexual revolution, now it's a complex thing. We'll get back to that in a few weeks probably with Scripture. Because Christians are called to love everybody. But within the Christian community, there's very specific ways to be in relationship. But hate should never be a part of it. But the far ends of the sexual revolution, most men in this country, it's just not something they can identify with. Now, I've seen great virtuous men who, although they did not understand in their hearts homosexuality, for example, have shown love to those they have known who were gay because they were good men. But that doesn't mean in their hearts that they could comprehend it. To those men, and I think still the vast majority of men in this country, they need a model of manhood that is more traditional. But it's not the model we think of often when we think of American mythology. But it's just as strong, it just ain't in the movies because it's boring. The shooter in Las Vegas, Stephen Paddock, was a gunslinger, not a homesteader. His father was a small-time hustler and a bank robber. He was a gunslinger. Now, I don't want to psychoanalyze, I don't know the man's history, and I pray for his soul. But he didn't have children, he was married a few times. They called him reclusive. Well, how could he have done this? He was so reclusive. Well, that's exactly the point. He did not have human connection nor the responsibility to develop himself as a person within the complexity of human relationship. He wasn't building up a church. He wasn't volunteering for the fire company. He wasn't helping out school bake sales and so forth. He wasn't cutting his neighbor's lawn because they were too old to do it. We desperately need a scriptural idea of Christian masculinity. See, I can tell you reams of stories of young men I have worked with who had no fathers in their life. And they didn't live in Idaho. They lived in urban centers. And they were gunslingers because they didn't have this model of masculinity. Not too long ago, a young man, me and my colleagues were trying to help. He was a gunslinger. Part of him wanted help, you could tell. He couldn't go the whole way because he's too broken. And so he's in jail for murder. He was a gunslinger. Many other stories I could tell of young folks I worked with who had their families murdered by gunslingers because they did not see a model of loving, committed, humble masculinity. When we start with the example of Christian masculinity, we must start with the Son of God himself, Jesus. Now, perhaps we don't think of Jesus as the model of masculinity, but he was both man and God. He was a man. And he was an example, a hard example. I get we're not perfect. We're going to sin like a mother freaker. We're crazy, especially guys. Guys are fools. Do you know that most people, by far more women are graduating from college than men? If you look at schools and who is doing best, it's mostly women. I get that men are still in charge at the top because if there's a certain segment of men, of the most elite and wealthy classes in this country that still have access to the greatest positions. But across the country where the foundations are laid, where the strength is kept, which is in the people, the middle class, the working class, men are not doing well. Young boys are not doing well. They need a model of masculinity. Let's look at some stories of Jesus and his masculinity. This is from the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 32 through 36. Jesus had very good friends, a brother and two sisters. They were the sisters of the brother. They were Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. John 11, 32 through 36. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And when Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" And they replied, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to cry. The Jews said, "See how much he loved him?" Jesus began to cry. Jesus had social networks. He had friends and family that he loved, and he wasn't afraid to show it. He wasn't afraid to show his sadness. He wasn't afraid to weep. He wasn't afraid to show vulnerability. He wasn't afraid to show that he loved, and that he loved deeply. That's manhood. Let's look at another good story. Matthew 26, 36 through 46. The Gospel of Matthew 26, 36 through 46. Then Jesus, vulnerability. You can say it, Papa Sanchez. You studied this back in Cooter School. Vulnerability. You know, I grew up in the country and I can't say rural. Rural. It's hard to say all those R's in there. Oh, I live in the city too. I live to all places, folks. From all things to all people. Mostly crazy person, crazy people. Oh, I've been with the millennials. I've been with the hoity-toities. I've been with folks in the hood. At some deep existential level, we all went to Cooter School together. Then, Power to the State of Jones. Go watch the movie. All right. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. Do. Gethsemane. Do. Gethsemane. Do. Gethsemane. He said to his disciples, "Stay here while I go and pray over there." When he took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, he began to feel sad and anxious. And then he said to them, "I'm very sad. It's as if I'm dying. Stay here and keep alert with me." And then he went a short distance farther and fell on his face and prayed. "My Father, if it's possible, take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but thy will be done." And he came back to the disciples and found them sleeping. He said to Peter, "Couldn't you stay alert 1 hour with me? Stay alert and pray so that you won't give in to temptation. The spirit is eager, but the flesh is weak." A second time he went away and prayed, "My Father, if it's not possible that this cup be taken away unless I drink it, then let it be what you want." Again he came and found them sleeping. Their eyes were heavy with sleep. But he left them and again went and prayed the same words for the third time. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Will you sleep and rest all night? Look, the time has come for the Son of Man to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. Here comes my betrayer." See, didn't you know this is one of the great pericopes? Pericope, that's like a small passage. The great passage of manhood in all of civilization, because it's God showing what manhood is. Jesus had his brothers, the disciples. To flourish, to be healthy and stable, men need brothers. Those could be biological brothers, but they don't have to be. Men need to be connected to other men, to hang out with them, to be held accountable by them, to do things that they have in common that are constructive. And that could be being at the volunteer fire company together. That can be in a bike riding club on the weekends. That can be just male friends hanging out. But men need brothers. They need other men that they think and they know they can count on. And this is because I believe deeply often men have been hurt by other men in their lives, and they need men they know they can count on. Jesus had his brothers, and he just wanted to be able to count on them. It was the hardest day of his life. The crucifixion on Friday, Good Friday, was not the hardest day. The night before, when he had to look death in the face, that was the hardest day. And he went up to pray. And he just needed his brothers, the disciples, to stay awake with him, to keep watch, to be there for him. And he showed that Jesus was not self-sufficient. This myth of self-sufficiency. No human being is self-sufficient. The great teaching of the Christian gospel is when we admit we are weak, that's the only time we are strong. St. Paul says it. That's why Jesus needed his brothers. He needed their help. And Jesus needed God, the Father. Jesus said, if you can, take this cup from me. Jesus says, I don't have the strength to do this myself. I don't have the strength to go through with this sacrifice for humanity, to be crucified, to have nails pounded through my hands. I do not have the strength. And in this great documentary of the Vietnam War, there was one Marine from Pennsylvania, and he had done his tour. He's ready to get out of that hellhole. They were about to put him on the helicopter, and his platoon was called to go into Hue during the Tet Offensive. And so he didn't go home. He went with the Marines into the Tet Offensive. Brotherhood. Leave no man behind. But the disciples fell asleep. Jesus knew he needed his brothers, and he knew he needed God the Father. He couldn't do it himself. He wasn't self-sufficient. See, men get themselves in trouble. Like, I'm going to be self-sufficient and the world blows up. I'm going to take care of myself and I'm going to be fine. I'm going to go out and live all by myself. I'm going to store up ammunition in. Hey, I believe in guns and hunting. You can have guns for hunting. But if it's about being self-sufficient and taking on the world, you're going to descend into madness within yourself. Because you think that is manhood. But manhood is about being connected to other people. To help them because you are strong. To rely upon their help when you need help. And to say, God, I can't do this by myself. I can't do this by myself. I am not strong enough. I humbly submit to you, for you are my strength. Jesus needed God, and Jesus needed brothers. I know really wonderful men who are very strong, but are connected in many ways to others. And they look out for the potential lone wolves, those who don't have people in their lives, those who are estranged from their children, divorced and don't have anybody, and they make sure they're there for them. Now, for men, often it doesn't have to be you go and you cry and watch a movie and with tears coming out your eyes. It doesn't have to be that. Hey, if that's your thing, that's cool too, man, but it doesn't have to be that. Sometimes when someone's in hospital, you just go see them. How you do? You stop by their house. There's a barbecue, you invite him. Because you say, man, that's a lone wolf. He's by himself. And men don't do well. Invite him to your nice little house church. Because we're all, who's watching this, we're all starting little house churches, right? Even if you got another church on Sundays, you're starting a Christian community in your church. Invite them over. Invite them for a meal. Pray with them. Pray for them. Pray for them in church. This is the practical grace part. What can you do? Connect with the lone wolves. Support each other in brotherhood. Be there for each other. Invite each other to men's retreats. Our time is drawing nigh, but I want to read another scripture. Let's look at what you got here. I think it's 2 Timothy, 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 12. Now this is about supervisors or elders in the church, but it is speaking about men holding a position, so it's talking about how men should act. Leadership in the church is very complex, and there are women deaconesses, there are women leaders of the house church in the church, and so women should be very much involved in church leadership. This particular passage is talking about men in leadership, and so I'm going to read this about Christian manhood. 2 Timothy. No, 1 Timothy. Come on. I know you didn't go over to Aunt Sally's liquor cabinet yet. Get out the Bible. Go over there and get it. Have some whiskey neat and get your Bible out. No more than one glass, though. The Bible says don't get drunk. It says it right here. I'm going to read it to you. First, keep saying 2 Timothy, Pappy Sanchez. 1 Timothy 3. This 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 12. This saying is reliable. If anyone has a goal to be a supervisor in the church, they want a good thing. So the church's supervisor must be without fault. They should be faithful to their spouse, sober, modest, and honest. They should show hospitality and be skilled at teaching. They shouldn't be addicted to alcohol or a bully. Instead, they should be gentle, peaceable, and not greedy. They should manage their own household well. They should see that their children are obedient with complete respect. Because if they don't know how to manage their own household, how can they take care of God's church? They shouldn't be new believers so that they won't become proud and fall under the devil's spell. And they should also have a good reputation with those outside the church so that they won't be embarrassed and fall into the devil's trap. Notice how this is the epitome of the definition of householder manhood and the exact antithesis of gunslinger manhood. They should be faithful to their spouse. It isn't about sexual conquest. It's about the respect of a woman you've made commitment to. They should be sober. Now this means sober as in calm and clear-headed, but also sober as in not drunk or high. Now, Christianity is a great religion of mercy to those in addiction, and salvation is possible, but the goal of mature Christian manhood is to be sober, to be modest. Modest being humble, to put others before yourself, and honest. Show hospitality. Invite others into your home. Shouldn't be addicted to alcohol. Gunslingers drink like crazy. Homesteaders are about the family and what sets a good example for others. They shouldn't bully. Instead, they should be gentle. Christian manhood is gentle, peaceable, and not greedy. We need a return to Christian manhood. It will help us return our families to greater strength, our churches and intermediate institutions to greater strength. Because even if there aren't jobs, or the jobs are too hard and we don't want to work that hard, we can be loving with our family and our children down the street, our people in the church. We can grow a garden and for not much money, feel a sense of accomplishment for helping God produce something out of the earth and to feed our family. We can help out where we can help out. We cannot try to be self-reliant, but to be God-reliant. We can stop feeling sorry for ourselves because we're not victims. We have been blessed by God. We can humble ourselves to accept help from others just as we will help others when we can. And we can rely on God. See, there are several forces, many of them not bad in themselves, which has led to a severe crisis of manhood in the United States of America. There's the severe changes of the 60s and the sexual revolution, number one. There's the changes of jobs going overseas and the loss of stable jobs to automation. There's a breakdown of intermediate institutions. And there's the advent of technology taking over our brains and our world. See, when the Second Amendment was drafted, it was literally impossible for an individual to commit mass murder. Because once you shoot someone, it took about 5 minutes to reload and they'd beat the crap out of you. Technology changes everything. Men and boys spending hours upon hours on video games melts your mind and takes you into that world of lone wolf, gunslinger isolation, away from the responsibility of connecting. Technology in itself can be used for some good things. But the point is, we must rebuild through cultural change our intermediate institutions. Men, older men, must look for younger men to mentor. We have to rebuild the home and the church based out of the home as the center of our community. We have to love and be gentle. If you're a real man, you have nothing to prove. There's no one to be angry at. And by daggum, you ain't a victim of anything. Because whether the world did something to you or not, you're blessed because God has given you life. So let's get over ourselves. Let us love and serve. And let us bring Christian manhood back to our nation. Amen.